my behaviour as a baby and a child wasn't quite there. I think I was particularly naughty, and showing some signs of distress, everything like that. My mum and dad, or my parents rather, had had me at the doctors quite a fair number of times. It was never diagnosed there and then. At the very end, I think after various consultations and stuff like that, there's one doctor that thought that I should have maybe went to a place called St Giles, which doesn't exist anymore. I think that was probably the old hearing centre kind of place, and it was the guys that had diagnosed me with being deaf, and that's where I found out that everyone else will know this, but there's a coil inside your ear. I'd lost the hairs on my ear, on that coil rather, which I guess led me to being deaf.
I grew up as a deaf person in Scotland. I was the only deaf person in the whole of my family. They were all hearing. So I was the only one that used British Sign Language. So I needed to communicate through sign language. Everybody in my family, well, they weren't fluent. It was mostly home signs that we used. I could communicate well enough with my family, with my brothers and my sisters. I had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Now my younger brother, well, he was very fluent in BSL. He's almost like a deaf person, even though he was hearing. So we could communicate really well. There was only 3 years between us. With my 3 older siblings, my 2 sisters and my brother, well, the 3 of them, they didn't sign so well. My mum and dad are hearing. In fact, my whole family are hearing. I was the only deaf person in my family. I don't have any brothers or sisters. Well, really because my mum and dad didn't know how to cope with me as a deaf child. So they agreed not to have any more babies, and I wished that I'd had brothers and sisters. It was very disappointing. When I was growing up, for Christmas meals or birthdays or whatever occasion, everything was fine. I mean, we would go and see friends. Everybody could use sign language because my parents had lots of deaf friends. So signing was really the norm. But with my brother, who's hearing, if he was going to a friend's place for a party or whatever, my parents would always drop him off and leave and then go and pick him up. They never stayed with him because my mother couldn't communicate with the hearing parents. So I think my brother felt different from me in that way, where we had all this access to sign language and that wasn't the case with him. The first school that I went to was at Henderson Row. Now that's in Edinburgh, and it's at Stockbridge. When I went into the school for the first time, my parents went with me, and I noticed that there was all these hands waving everywhere. I said to my mum, "What's that?" And she said, "That's sign language." But my parents didn't know how to sign. And I didn't know how to sign either. So I was stuck. I had to be really patient for 2 years until I left that place and I went to another school. So when I was 6 years old, I went to this other school, which was at St Giles School for the Deaf. But there was no sign language used there. It was all speech and talking. So I grew up going, first of all, to a 3-in-1 school. And what that means, it was a deaf school, is that there was a nursery, a primary and a secondary school all in one. And that was in Glasgow, in Milton. And that was really the Glasgow School for the Deaf there. So I grew up there from the age of 2.5 right through to 14 years, at which point I moved to Donaldson's school. So when I was 14, I went to this new deaf school in Edinburgh, and I stayed there. I was a boarder at Donaldson's. And I stayed there for several years. Everybody, all the children and all the teachers, it was amazing. Everybody could sign. We could fully communicate with each other. We had access. There was none of this speech stuff going on, none of that. All of us could sign fully in BSL, and that was so important. It's so important for deaf children, including myself, to be able to communicate, to access our education. If that wasn't the case in BSL, well, my education would have been terrible. I wouldn't have been able to, achieve what I did by going to that school. When I was 11 years old, I moved to England, really to go to a better school. I stayed there. I was a boarder at that school, right down in the south of England. I went to Mary Hare School. That was a really big change for me to go to that school because it was a staunchly oral method school. We weren't allowed to sign there. So it was all lip reading and sometimes a bit of writing. But the teachers and the education it was a very high standard compared to Donaldson's, of course. And as time went on, I grew to like it at Mary Hare. I got used to things. It was oral there, but because my family are all hearing, I was used to not much signing. So when I got to Mary Hare, some of us, of course, would sign in secret, the kids, when the teachers weren't looking, which is funny, of course. But what was interesting is that they had lots on offer: sports, football, swimming. There was an awful lot going on there. A very different experience in England to my education in Scotland. But I liked them both, Donaldson's and Mary Hare. So, when I was 18 years old, I went to England. I went to Doncaster College for the Deaf, which is a college on the same site as a deaf school. I had a little bit of sign language and I was learning it slowly, but I became quite fluent and my parents were amazed at how fluent I became in sign language. And then I left Doncaster College in 1992. Then I started work in 1996 and I've worked there ever since, so 23 years.
I did teach myself how to do how to lip read. It's probably something I wasn't aware of actually. When I first started to do it, it wasn't until I guess a later age I did notice that I was able to do it. There was one thing that always stands out for me on this one, if I ever discuss this, is I do feel it's a survival technique. If I'm in a loud room or I don't know, a pub or something like that, if there's various people talking at the same sort of time, etc., I don't really need to, not that it's right, but I don't really need to, fully engage. I can look at somebody and know what they're saying. Something always comes up about accents when I'm asked about this. Bit of a strange one, but I always imagine if I know somebody's accent, I'll always picture their accent in my head. And I've always, I guess it's just my technique of doing that, but I've always, been able to gather what they're saying through imagining that person's accent. Even if we're watching telly and stuff and my partner or parents or something, the one that always stands out is football. I can tell what everybody's saying on the telly and stuff like that. Again, survival, and something that probably really has got me through, I guess, my life, and something that I really heavily rely on, and something I'm really thankful for.
My family didn't use sign language. Most of the time, they would speak. So that's why when I went to school, I learnt sign language there. I learnt sign language really when I was 14, but I've had a deaf friend now for 44 years. So like me, he's deaf and uses sign language. So I learnt sign language really there, and that gave me more confidence. So by the time I got to Doncaster College for the Deaf, I could sign, but I really felt that when I look back at my education at St Giles and at Donaldson School, that there was a real problem there. There wasn't an understanding of how we should sign. There were different education methods. They were speaking to us as deaf people, and I really didn't understand why they were doing that. I really want equality and fairness I'd rather that my parents had signed than speak, but they were frightened. They would rather speak. And of course, they knew that I had a pretty good voice and that I can hear a little bit as well. I have children. I've got 4 kids. When I first became pregnant, I was 20 years old. And at that time, I was working in a hearing organisation. I only worked there for a year. When I became pregnant, for me, it was a good excuse just to get out of there and leave the job, to be honest. My first child, when they were born, they were diagnosed as hearing. And I thought, okay, well, what do I do now? What do I do with this hearing child? I thought, okay, well, I just taught them to sign. And then when my second child was born, only a year apart, when they were 1 and 2, we could have conversations in sign language fluently, the 3 of us. I really felt that they were almost deaf because we were just using this first language between us. But I did realise they weren't getting any speech input. So I moved them into the nursery at the Donaldson School for the Deaf because the teachers there could sign but also would speak. They would use their voices, which meant that my children could learn how to use their voices and speak because they were used to just signing. And for me, I could communicate with the teachers in sign language and find out what's going on with the kids. And that was easy. But when they got to 5 years old, I realised they had to go to a mainstream school. They weren't deaf, so they had to go to a normal school. So moving them into the school was fine. I had 2 more kids, so I have 4 altogether, all hearing. And I was a bit nervous about how things were going to go at the school. We'd write notes, but communication was a real struggle between me and the teachers. And events like nativity plays or whatever, I would go along and there was no interpreter. It was incredibly frustrating. I'd sit there just watching my kids go up, perform for 5 minutes, and I'd be stuck there for a whole 2 hours with no interpreter. How was I supposed to enjoy it? So I wasn't having that. So I had a good chat with the head teacher and I explained about what it was like for me as a deaf person, having a deaf culture and identity. So I gave them a bit of deaf awareness, really. And from that point onwards, they regularly booked interpreters. And that was great because it meant that I didn't miss out on anything. I had access. So with my hearing kids, I think it's really great for them. They're lucky they've got 2 languages. They're bilingual. They can sign and speak. And that's an advantage for them.